Hello and welcome to Spectator TV's weekly US election special. Now, the Spectator is expanding fast in America, and you can be part of this success story. Get 10% off a subscription by going to spectator.us/subscribe and enter the promo code TV. It's not that difficult. We'll send you a stylish monthly magazine, Spectator's US edition, and you'll have full access to our website and to all our newsletters. We'll even throw in a free whiskey tumbler. That's an offer only for Spectator TV viewers. I'm afraid you have to buy your own whiskey. Now, I'm delighted to be joined by Sohrab Ahmari, the opinion editor of the New York Post, Jacob Heilbrunn, the editor of National Interest, Sarah Elliott of Republicans Abroad UK, and the Spectator's US editor, Freddie Gray. We're going to be talking over the next hour about Hunter Biden. Bet you didn't guess that. The troubling role of big tech in this election on the Biden case, what a Joe Biden administration might look like, and what will happen to the Republican Party after Trump if he loses on November the 3rd. First up, Hunter Biden. Now, back in December, President Trump was impeached on the grounds that he'd abused his power by pressuring the president of Ukraine to dig up dirt on Joe Biden. The dirt was that Biden's son, Hunter, who was being paid large sums of money to sit on the board of a Ukrainian energy company, Burisma, despite having no qualifications or experience in the energy business, but because he was Joe Biden's son. Now, the impeachment attempt failed, and the story kind of died until this week, when the New York Post published emails from a board member of Burisma thanking Hunter for the introduction to his father, then the vice president. It was, by any standards, a sensational story published by America's oldest newspaper. There followed more allegations about Hunter getting substantial remuneration from Chinese companies for acting as an intermediary to his father. But big tech wasn't happy. Facebook and Twitter decided to suppress the New York Post story. People who shared the story on their social media feeds found themselves censored, even banned. The White House press secretary, Kylie McEnany, well, she had her Twitter account blocked for having shared the story. Twitter claimed the story was flagged for being inaccurate, then claimed it contained personal information. Both Twitter and Facebook now have a lot of egg on their face. Sohrab Ahmari is with the newspaper that ran this story. Sohrab, it's pretty significant, not just the story, but the big tech censorship. Did you see this coming? Did you ever think there was a chance that they would censor this story?
Thanks for having me, Neil. I'll be honest, I work on the opinion pages and manage our columnists and op-ed contributors. So I had nothing to do with the production, editing and publishing of the story. I encountered it when we ran the paper the following day, and like everyone else. So I can't tell you what my colleagues who were the editors and journalists on the story thought or whether they were shocked. But I would say that having observed the way big tech works and increasingly puts its thumb on the scales of our democracy, given its vast power over the flow of information, I would say that I was not shocked, but I was shocked by the blatantness of it and the sort of boldness with which essentially democratic operatives working at the highest levels in these companies boasted about censoring the story. So it didn't begin with Twitter. It began with Facebook, and Andy Stone, who's a communications director at Facebook, sent out a tweet early in the morning saying, I won't link to that awful New York Post story, but I will say that it deserves to be fact-checked, and in the meanwhile, we're going to reduce circulation. Now, Andy Stone, before joining Facebook, worked at Senator Barbara Boxer's office. She was a Democratic senator from California, and for the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. So here he was, a former high-ranking Democratic staffer with his hands over the levers of the internet, where free speech lives or dies in our time, saying, yeah, I don't like that story, before there had been any dispute about the underlying facts. And bear in mind, Neil, there still hasn't been any major dispute to the core facts. In other words, if Biden or Hunter wanted this story to go away, the easiest thing they could do was to say, those emails aren't authentic. That laptop doesn't belong to Hunter. They haven't done that. And even then, the sort of scrutiny that stories are subjected to hadn't played out. So preemptively, they reduced. Reduced circulation of the story, and it's a new thing. I mean, there were plenty of stories over the past few years that were anti-Trump stories published by left of center media, such as the story about Michael Cohen being in Prague, Michael Cohen being suborned to perjury by the president, that factually collapsed, and yet they weren't banned. They were factually questionable, and yet their circulation wasn't reduced.
No, I mean, I can see plenty of stories social media has repeated without doing the kind of checking they're talking about. We still don't know for sure, do we, if a meeting between this Ukrainian and then Vice President Biden took place, though the denial from the Biden team was somewhat caveated, wasn't it? Because it said there was no record on his official schedule, I think was roughly the wording used. I'm not sure yet. They have not categorically denied that the meeting took place, have they?
No, their initial statement was very carefully worded. Neil, you're a journalist, so you know PR people can be very meticulous with words. They said that the story didn't take place as alleged by the New York Post. And then when Politico did follow up, they just didn't rule out. They said, we can't rule out the possibility that this, but it was cursory and informal. Okay. But it was not categorical.
So the New York Post, as things stand at the moment, it stands by the story. There's no reason for it, in its view, to withdraw or qualify anything that it's printed so far.
Absolutely. I mean, we've not run a single correction. I mean, we look forward to it being scrutinized, and we've been extremely transparent about what we know and what we don't know about the provenance of the material. In other words, we were very more so than, let's say, the Trump tax story in the Times a few weeks ago, or any number of other stories that have been released. We said, look, this laptop was dropped off. The laptop owner never came to pick it up, nor did he pay for the repairman's services. The repairman, who we know is a Republican, looked at the material, thought they were shady, contacted the FBI, but before turning over the hardware to the FBI, he also made a copy, gave that copy to Bob Costello, who's Rudy Giuliani's lawyer. We learned about the fact of the hardware being around from Steve Bannon, and eventually got it from Rudy Giuliani. And we were very clear about the fact that we are not sure whether it was Hunter himself who dropped it off for repair. In other words, if we wanted to be taking liberties, we would have said, yes, it's Hunter's laptop. But we didn't do that. We said it's unclear whether it was Hunter who dropped it off. So at every step, we've been transparent about how we got hold of it. And there's been no denial or counterfactual material brought forward that where we would retract or correct a single comment. Okay.
Jacob Heilbrunn, it's a great story. No question, at least I think it's a great story anyway. It's probably not a game changer though, is it, for the election?
No, there are two aspects. First, there's the Washington Post and NBC are alleging that au contraire, Giuliani got wrapped up into a Russian disinformation campaign. So that's the counter attack. Apparently, supposedly the FBI has been investigating this for a while. Either way, I think the American public has burned out on Russia. Russia itself is playing no significant role in the campaign. Donald Trump hoped that the unmasking scandal that he kept touting would prove to be pivotal in the election. The Justice Department went nowhere with that investigation. So I don't think that there's there might be a little smoke, but I don't think that there's a serious fire here that has occurred.
Sarah,
and
let me put that to Sarah
Sure.
Elliott, and then I'll come back to you, Jacob. Well, that's probably a reasonable judgment, is it not, Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that this story is going to have a lot of legs. I also think the Russian issue is, I think people have blocked it out. They've heard it too much. It's too murky. You know, it's really, I honestly don't think that people are actually that undecided in this election. So I'm not sure how much could really affect it in the next couple of weeks.
You think they've made their minds up already?
Yes, I think pollsters are debating what percentage are actually undecided, from 6%, 14 to 25%. But I mean, I don't understand how someone can be an undecided voter in the Trump era, and especially after 2 years of a Democratic primary, now a general election. So I think it's just so divisive right now. You know, lawn signs are being battled in America, suburbia. You look at the New York Times bestseller list, and it's love Trump, hate Trump, love Trump, hate Trump. It's right down the middle, and it will come down to turnout.
Sohrab, what do you make of, I saw the Washington Post and the NBC stuff. And I mean, I know they both have for years now been obsessed with Russia, particularly in relationship to Donald Trump. I was quite surprised that what they were writing, there were very little facts there were nothing on the record to substantiate what they were claiming.
Yeah, someone said if you read between the lines of the Washington Post story, it actually suggests that there is something here, or that certainly that our story is not easily debunked, which is funny because it was the framing versus what was left unsaid clashed that way. But I just want to go back briefly. I do think it could have, I don't know if it's demoralizing impact or what the precise nature of the impact would be, but there is the fact that, you know, Democrats have been talking about the Trump team, quote unquote, colluding with a foreign power for the past 3.5, 4 years. And there's this delicious irony in the fact that Robert Mueller, his report definitively said there had been no collusion between Team Trump and the Kremlin. But that after all of this, there's a quality, I don't know if it's Greek tragedy or comedy, it ends with us learning that, you know, the Mr. Norms, Mr. returning us to the pre-2016 politics of high ideals and high standards. You know, his son worked for did kind of influence peddling in one of the most corrupt countries in the world, Ukraine. So, you know, I mean, are most people's minds made up? But yes. But does this story cast doubt on Biden's pitch as Mr. Norms, Mr. Standards? It does, I think.
Freddie, of course, in a sense, if you have a great story and someone tries to censor it, I mean, it's the best thing that could happen for the story. When I was editor of my university newspaper, way back just after Gutenberg had invented the presses, one of the student unions banned one of my editions. It was the highest selling edition ever of the time when I was editor of the university newspaper. And thanks to Facebook and Twitter, would it not be true to say that more people now know about this story than would ever have otherwise known about it?
Undoubtedly. And that's why, with all conspiracies, it's stupidity always far more than anything sinister, because what they've done has backfired spectacularly. I think Sohrab's right. This is a significant story. It would have been a big story. It would have been nothing like the scale that it is now if it had just been allowed to rip through the internet. So, and I think that's where it could have an effect on the election, because everybody's sort of aware of the fact now that Hunter Biden was shady. It doesn't quite influence their opinion of Joe Biden maybe as much as it should. But I think what drives people crazy is this idea that our lives are so dominated by tech now, and that tech has this tremendous power over us. And there is clearly a significant political bias within big tech. And we've been told for a long time, we were told that big tech, that Facebook, Cambridge Analytica was what got Trump elected. And actually, it seems if there is a sinister bias going on, it goes the other way.
Well, it is interesting, Jacob, that those who claimed that it was dirty works by Cambridge Analytica and so on that swung Brexit to leave and swung 2016 to Trump. Here you have an upfront example of big tech interfering in certain freedoms. These same voices are rather quiet about it all at the moment. They're not saying very much at all.
Well, they've been squirming for a while, but I guess my query is, what is the actual obligation of these tech companies that are private companies and can essentially operate with impunity? And when you sign up, whether it's on Twitter or Facebook, you're operating by their rules. And there are no rules of the road. There's no law saying that they have to operate in specific ways. Why can't they do whatever they please?
Well, I agree with you, Jacob, to an extent, but this brings us back to the publishers versus platforms debate. And if these companies are going to start censoring and editing and effectively making editorial decisions about what's on their site, then they become much more responsible legally as to what is on their sites, what they are publishing. And if that's going to be the case, they're going to find they have an enormous amount of legal difficulty down the road.
Jacob?
I guess that's fair, but so far they've managed to elude and evade any responsibility, with Facebook being perhaps the premier example. And I'm not persuaded that that's going to change, and that Twitter has been more aggressive than the others. But as far as real legal action against them, I don't see it yet.
So if I may jump in here, and I apologize for two things. One is I have to leave early. And second one is I kept calling Andrew, I kept calling him Neil, and this is my millennial Twitter
You're not the first
brain.
to do that. There's a problem if you have two names, either of which could be your first name.
And also your Twitter handle, this is my, I recognize you by AF Neil, so I'm like, Neil guy. I apologize for that.
Not at all.
But just to make my final point before I have to take off is that, look, I think from the point of view of conservatives I'm speaking with, a Rubicon was crossed when they did this so blatantly, so systematically. Some people talked about it as a dress rehearsal for election day. Like, what would they do? If the Biden campaign is unhappy with a certain right of center voices comments about what's happening in the election, could they suddenly systematically shut us off? So there's a kind of libertarian argument that for long had a kind of stranglehold on the conservative mind when it comes to these tech issues, which is precisely the one mentioned earlier, which is that, look, they're private companies and they can do whatever they want. But given that, free speech really lives or dies on these platforms. I mean, I could go on a street corner in Manhattan and bang a drum and say, Hunter Biden is corrupt, but, very few people would hear me and I would look like a nutter. But if I have a story that shows evidence, but then I can't, vast swaths of the American public can't read the story because it's been disappeared, then that alarms a lot of conservatives. So people like Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri and others who have been pushing to reform Section 230 to say, you either act like a platform or we will treat you like a publisher. They now have the wind in their backs because of this. And, Chairman Ajit Pai of the Federal Communications Commission just released a statement saying that his regulatory body has authority to properly interpret what Section 230 means. And that's very serious because that understanding could stay in place even if Biden gets elected. In other words, when FCC issues a ruling about what the law really means, and if it's been misunderstood over the past few years as the internet has evolved, the fact of a Biden presidential victory, election victory, wouldn't change that interpretation, unless we want to go for a big legal constitutional battle about what regulatory agencies can do and what authority they have. But I'll stop there, and I apologize for having to leave early, but thank you all for having me.
Sohrab Ahmari from the New York Post, thanks for joining us. Remaining with us, Freddie Gray, Sarah Elliott, and Jacob Heilbrunn. Jacob, let me come back to you again. There's always a legal element to media. Media is the only industry actually mentioned in the US Constitution in the First Amendment. There's no other industry is mentioned in the Constitution. There is always a legal dimension to it. And in a way, perhaps the way to look particularly at Facebook is as a near monopoly. It's the information age equivalent of the robber barons of the late 19th century, of the railways and the steel, of oil, Rockefeller and Carnegie and all the rest of it. But of course, a previous Republican president did something about that, Teddy Roosevelt. The Republicans have moaned and complained about it, but they've had the White House for 4 years, and I'm not aware that anything has happened, has it?
It hasn't. And interestingly, I think there are voices on the liberal side that are pushing for a crackdown on what you rightly call the monopoly exercised by Facebook, that Mark Zuckerberg is too powerful for his own good and for the good of the United States. And I think it'll be interesting to see. I don't know how much, given all the domestic problems the United States is experiencing right now, I don't know how much of a push or how much time Congress will have to go after these companies. But personally, my own impulse would be yes, that the moment has arrived where you do need strong reform and potential breakup of these companies, because they have amassed a kind of power that we probably have never seen in the United States in its entire history.
Interesting, and not just in the United States. Freddie, just finish with you on this. Am I right in thinking, this may be going too far, but that Facebook and Twitter are really beginning to regret what they did, that it's really backfired on them?
I think they are. And actually, I do feel quite sorry for Mark Zuckerberg. I mean, he's not an easy man to pity, but I do think, he got so much flack in 2016 because the world he lives in blamed him for Trump. It blamed him for Brexit. Angela Merkel was caught sort of berating him for just allowing, politically unacceptable messaging on his platform. And I think actually, Facebook for a long time tried to be the most free speech of the major platforms, and yet they always get the blame. They have this enormous power, but it's hard to see how they could possibly regulate it. And so I think I'm not usually pro-government taking things over, but I think the idea that social media might become a public utility in the end is starting to look quite attractive.
Well, then it would be regulated. If it's a monopoly utility, it would be regulated. Okay, let's move on. It's perhaps part of the agenda of a Joe Biden administration. I rather doubt it. What would it look like? Mr. Biden has been in Washington for almost 5 decades. We should have a clear idea of what he stands for, but do we? Jacob, let me come to you. He's a mainstream Democrat. His interests seem to have been for a while more in foreign policy than domestic affairs. There isn't a Bidenism, is there? There isn't a particular Joe Biden way of looking at the American domestic scene, or a raft of policies that you would associate with Mr. Biden, is there?
I think that things could move very quickly if the Democrats win the Senate. That in that case, you would see a quite radical impulse towards overhauling the United States. You would see a rise in taxes. You'd see the repeal of the Trump tax cuts. You would see the Justice Department would be remade. Perhaps Elizabeth Warren would be the Attorney General. You would see a huge push for an infrastructure bill aimed at employing Americans. So I think if the Democrats win the Senate, you could also see the end of the filibuster. You could see a push to making DC and Puerto Rico states. The impulse among progressives and liberals is for a radical overhaul of the American political system, not simply to restore the economy, but to enact fundamental reform that incidentally would probably have the effect of entrenching a Democratic majority for decades.
Sarah Elliott, I can see if the Democrats take the Senate, they can do, or they may attempt to do what Jacob is saying there. They could end the filibuster, by which you need 60 votes in certain important pieces of legislation or actions the Senate's taking. They could give statehood to Puerto Rico and DC. That would certainly, for the foreseeable future, mean 4 more Democratic senators in the Senate. And there is the option, not sure Mr. Biden's so keen on it, but he doesn't want to upset his left, of stacking the Supreme Court. FDR attempted it in 37. It didn't really work. It backfired and he pulled back. Though the court did change some of its rulings after the threat. So it did kind of work for FDR. So I understand all that. But if I look at what Mr. Biden himself stands for, if he would reverse the tax cuts, the Trump tax cuts, but only for those earning over 400,000. It would take the top rate of tax back to still under 40%, where it was with Obama. And he plans to increase corporation tax not to where it was under Obama, somewhere in between Trump and Obama. They're pretty mainstream Democratic tax raises, are they not?
I disagree. I mean, first off, Donald Trump doubled the child tax credit, went from $6,000 to $12,000. That means you can write off $12,000 off your taxes. That's huge for a family of 4 or a family of 5, 6, etc. Also, we had the most uncompetitive corporate tax rate in the Western world before Trump came into office at 35%. He lowered it and it brought over $500 billion back to the US immediately in the first 6 months after the tax cuts.
Not much of which went into investment. It mainly went on share buybacks and paying off debt and onto the corporate balance sheets. Well, there was no boost to business investment.
Well, I would disagree, because the economy actually has boomed to the best we've had on record. The lowest unemployment for minorities, the biggest drop in the poverty rate, the lowest it's been in over 50 years. I mean, honestly, the economy was the best we'd had it on record. And I don't know why you want to take away those incentives for small business, for big business, for individuals and families by raising taxes. Yes, that's the typical Democratic thing to do, but it's incredibly uncompetitive. And we're rebounding, we're having a V-shaped recovery in America right now. We've almost gotten back over half of our jobs. 22 million jobs have come back since COVID lockdown. So I don't know why that's a good thing for the American public. And also, you know, if Donald Trump were to come into office, he potentially could make a lot of these tax cuts permanent that we're sunsetting, and also cut capital gains even more.
Well, what's Donald Trump's plan to cut the deficit?
That's a very good question. He's not a deficit hawk. He's not a fiscal conservative. This is a concern for a lot of us in the party. But the argument that people like Larry Kudlow, who's his national economic advisor and was OMB director under Reagan, would say is, you have to create wealth. You can keep these spending programs and entitlements. And I should add that our entitlement spending for Social Security, which is our state pension, is going to run out in 4 years. We have over $100 trillion worth of unfunded liabilities in the United States right now. We do need a Congress and a president to take this seriously. This is not on the agenda right now.
But I would suggest to you that whether it's Mr. Trump or Mr. Biden in the White House at the inauguration come the 20th of January, they are both going to run unprecedented peacetime deficits throughout the 1920s, the 2020s. That Mr. Trump will do it because he'll cut even more taxes and make some of these taxes permanent. They're all unfunded. Mr. Biden is going to raise over 10 years about $3 trillion on taxes, but he's going to spend $7 trillion. So he's going to raise it too. I mean, frankly, whether the deficit's caused by more spending or unfunded tax cuts is a deficit, is a deficit, is a deficit. There's no difference.
Well, you know, the fiscal conservative in me agrees with you to a large extent.
That's over. There's no one fiscal conservative now. You're all running massive deficits.
But what I'll say is that when you create wealth and growth, it's, you know, it's trickle down economics, supply side, Reaganomics, whatever you want to call it.
But Reagan ran massive deficits. Reagan ran massive deficits. At one stage, the deficit, which for these days was high, was 4.5% of GDP. His tax cuts never paid for themselves. That's never happened.
Well, it created a lot of economic stimulus that
That's true. I understand that. But it was deficit financed.
That helped our economy beat the Soviet Union, and that was the goal at the time.
Look, even the Scottish economy could beat the Soviet Union. I mean, I don't think that was a great yardstick there. Just one final point. You talk about the corporation tax. You're the highest in the world. You had the highest rate in the world, 35%, or not the highest in the world, but one of the highest.
Western world.
In the Western world, of course. But nobody paid it. The effective rate of corporation tax in America under Obama was 18% because there were so many deductions. Nobody paid it. And it didn't make any difference in the end. 18% was the average corporation tax in the world. You weren't uncompetitive. You just had a stupid high rate.
Well, I think the proof is in the pudding when how the economy responded and how much more foreign earned investment and foreign earned income came back to America. I think it does matter, and it needed to change, and I'm glad that it did. You've
had the slowest growth of any recovery since the Second World War.
No, that was Obama after the Great Recession.
No, but you take them both together, take Obama and Mr. Trump. The average rate of growth under Mr. Trump has been under 3%. That's the slowest rate of growth of any recovery.
I dispute that. I'm sorry.
Well, it's in the office of budget management. You'll get it there.
I mean, we actually have GDP over 2%. We had, 3. Unemployment's the lowest on record now.
No, I know the unemployment is. I understand that, and the black unemployment is. I got that. I understand that too. Let me bring Freddie in here. I mean, the fact is, I'm very cognizant of what Jacob said. Taking the Senate could be a game changer because it allows some fundamental changes, not just an economic policy that can go back and forward. I mean, frankly, the difference between Mr. Biden and Mr. Obama's policies will be pretty close to zero, I would mention. The Senate's a different matter. But if you take his tax and spend policies, they are pretty mainstream, Mr. Biden's, aren't they? They're not way out. He's said he's not having an AOC Green New Deal. He is raising. Half of his spending will be paid for by increases in taxes. It's a kind of FDR program with a green tinge, is it not?
I agree. I think Bidenomics it tries to sound FDR-like. I don't think that they've quite got theirs, in as much as I understand, they've quite got their sums are making any sense at all. I mean, 7 trillion is the commitment to a pandemic response. I think all of the inspections of his programs suggest he won't be able to raise more than 4 trillion in tax. I think it's going to be unbelievable deficits. I mean, you're right that Trump and Biden, they don't care. But I think Biden cares even less. But I think Biden actually isn't that interested in domestic policy, and Jacob will know much more about this than I. But I mean, his real area of interest, what he liked doing as vice president, was flying around the world, sewing up deals for his son Hunter. No, sorry, sewing up deals for America, and he's very. There was a Russian reset when he came in that he sort of managed to ruin in 2008 as vice president. He's very good at going around the world and sort of blundering. And I think that's what you'll have. You'll have a very foreign policy focused administration that will try to go back to the pre-Trump settings in world affairs. That is, the Iran deal's back on. Right. Paris Accords, right back into that.
The Atlantic Alliance.
The Atlantic Alliance. A Trans-Pacific Partnership will be back on. It'll just be, they'll just, in terms of America and the world, they'll just try and pretend the Trump thing never happened.
Jacob, I see you smiling there.
Well, I like the fact that Freddie, who spent the past 4 years wildly underestimating and soft pedaling Trump's deficiencies, is now exaggerating Biden's even before he's in office.
Okay, I'll just let that hang on the wall here. Perhaps the way to look at it is this, Jacob. You know, what Sarah and I were talking about corporation tax or deficits and growth, and does that? That's not what the American people are talking about, or even thinking about. The real Biden pitch is very reminiscent of Warren Harding's pitch in 1920, which was a return to normalcy. And that came after the First World War, the Spanish flu. There were race riots in America. There were arguments about immigration as well in 1919, 1920. And Harding just said, "You're exhausted with this guy, Wilson. He's exhausted himself. He's not even well. He's got the Spanish flu," which of course actually became a stroke. "I'm going to bring you back to normalcy." In a sense, that's basically Biden's pitch, is it not?
Right, exactly. The question is, I mean, Americans have been reeling since September 11th. And one of the reasons that Trump got elected was because of not just fatigue, but exhaustion with the foreign policy, with the neglect of the heartland, with the endless wars abroad, all of that. Now there's Trump fatigue. Is there a normality that America can return to? Is it a normal nation? I mean, my own suspicion is that Biden will discover that America has fundamentally changed and that he can't just rewind the clock back to some golden age.
And of course, that's what happened with Harding. He got elected in a return to normality. But of course, America did not return to normality. It invented something called the Roaring Twenties and prohibition and all the rest of it. So it
literally went on a bender.
It went on a bender, which ended with the biggest hangover of the 20th century, with unforeseen consequences. What do you say to that, Sarah? Republican friends that I speak to, and I don't just mean the kind of the never Trumpers or the Lincoln Project type Republicans. A lot of them, they're not huge Trump fans, but they just say, we're kind of exhausted. We're just, every morning we wake up and what's he done next? What's he tweeted next? What row are we getting into? We seem to have made enemies of our friends, the British, the Germans, the French, the Italians. And he cozies up to people who really should be our enemies, the Russians, the Chinese, Erdogan in Turkey, the Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia. Enough already, as they would say in New York. That's quite a powerful argument, is it not?
It is, but I have friends like that too, and we go round and round in circles. And this is the thing. Jacob makes a really good point. What is normal? Because you can't go back to the way it was before Trump. Our relationship with China is completely different now. Everything is out in the open. So are we going to elect a guy who basically oversaw the selling of all of our jobs overseas and also, got cash for access for his son in China? And back in May 2019, Biden was saying China's no competition for us. And then Defense Secretary Gates said, Joe Biden, he's a nice guy, but he's been on the wrong side of every foreign policy issue of the last 20 years. So I think Joe would love to go back to normal because that's what he knows. And you can't teach an old dog new tricks. He's 77, getting up there, as your cover so rightly points out this week. He's going to find it very difficult. And he's also going to find a lot of infighting from the progressive left of his party. They're going to be pushing him. And like you said, we don't really know what Bidenism is, except that we know that his voting record has gone increasingly left throughout his 47 years in the US Senate. And he has changed his position on everything. Whatever direction that the Democrats are going, that's where he changes. So you can't say that he's not going to be a puppet for the left. especially the far left of his party. He's put one of the most liberal senators on his ticket, Kamala Harris.
Well, Freddie, isn't the Biden presidency, if it happens, will be a transition presidency? And the real battle for the soul of America may be 2024, when the left could be much more ascendant in the Democrat Party, and the Republicans will have had to choose a new candidate. There may be elements of Trump about that, but it'll be more a Republican candidate than a Trump candidate. And that's when the real battle will take place, is it not?
I think almost certainly. I mean, the question is how quick the transition will be. I mean, will it be 4 years? Or, and this is an awkward point, and Jacob's going to accuse me of exaggerating Biden's defects again, but we really do need to talk about Biden's mental health. It's not just a right-wing canard that he's not all there. He's just not. Every day he makes a very silly mistake, and it's not just because he's got a speech impediment. He seems to have a kind of verbal dyspraxia where he said this week that he was running for Senate, for the Senate, and it's the second time he's done that this year. And someone has to say to him, no, it's the presidency that you're going for. And he says things like that a lot. So if he's elected, it may well be a kind of regency presidency where everything's really being run by Team Obama and possibly Kamala Harris, an increasing role for Kamala Harris. And he is a sort of background figure, a sort of figurehead, a kind of monarch.
Jacob, I'll let you respond, and then we're going to move to our third and final topic.
I flatly disagree. I think Biden, in retrospect, will be seen to have run a brilliant campaign, probably one of the most brilliant ones that we've seen in decades. If he wins this presidency in a landslide, he will have accomplished what no one has accomplished since Ronald Reagan. Barack Obama did not win by landslides. In recent decades, the American political system has been too evenly divided for anyone to score a big victory. As far as Biden's mental acumen, I think he's handled himself quite well in the debate with Trump. He did well in the town hall last night. I just don't see the problem. And also, if you notice during the campaign, they've essentially shut down Kamala Harris. It's Biden, insofar as he's campaigned, who has taken the leading role. So
I don't want to sound like a right-wing bore about...
I don't buy Freddie's argument.
I don't want to sound like a right-wing bore about that town hall last night, but I thought it was extraordinary. He wasn't asked one question about Hunter Biden, the major story that everyone's talking about, and they didn't see fit to ask him a question about it.
Wasn't that surprising, Jacob? Have American journalists or broadcast journalists lost their ability to ask the tough questions?
Well, no, you saw they gunned after Trump. Now, with Stephanopoulos being soft on Biden, maybe, but Biden also, Freddie, I just don't think that the Hunter Biden story is all that significant or of much interest in the American public. You may think that it should be, but it's not.
Okay, I've got no comeback to that other than a lot of people.
Of course, it won't be if journalists don't ask questions about it, Jacob.
I think the son of the president, of the future president, former vice president, being paid $50 million by a dodgy Ukrainian mining company when he had no relevant experience is quite a big story. I mean, and was clearly providing access to his father to this Ukrainian business.
You see, I think that the story, I don't put much stock in the Joe Biden angle. I think what's shocking is that Hunter Biden I don't think he got 50 million, but I still think it's emblematic of the way that sleaze has become normalized in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
There was nothing illegal about what he did. That
will be the return to normalcy that we might see.
Sarah, I saw you agreeing, nodding your head there.
Yeah, I mean, this is why Trump wants to drain the swamp. He's the swamp. You know, Joe Biden and the way his family have been leeches off of his power. And you see it with the emails in China and 850 here, and we can set up a holding company and da-da-da-da-da. I mean, it's so gross, and it's what Americans absolutely hate about politics.
But Mr. Trump hasn't drained the swamp. He's created a new swamp, of which his family are swamp kings and queens.
Well, I got to tell you, if you want to go, if you want to go back to normalcy, then it's going to be all these kingpins and their family just living off the largesse of public service. So I think.
You mean unlike the Trump family?
Well, I think they're entrepreneurs and business people. They'll go off and they'll go off and do other things, or maybe Don Jr. will try to run for president in 2024. But they like making money.
The Trump family keep their crookery in the private sector. They have the dignity to do that.
Yeah, they do that.
Well, you give me the perfect segue there, Sarah, into whether Trump Jr. runs in 2024 to talk about what will become of the Republican Party. Just for our final 10, 15 minutes or so, let's assume, and it's by no means an assumption we should take for granted, but let's assume that Mr. Trump does lose and that Joe Biden is the 46th president of the United States. What happens to the Republican Party? In a sense, Donald Trump launched a successful hostile takeover of the Republican Party. For most of his life, he wasn't even a Republican. He was a sort of New York Democrat. But he launched that hostile takeover. He has changed the nature of the Republican Party in the process. There's no doubt about that. The days of the old country club Republicans seem to be long gone. It's become increasingly a blue-collar party, a more white party compared to George Bush or even Ronald Reagan, getting support from there. He certainly changed it. So if he goes, what happens to the Trump Republican Party? Does it revert? Does it build on that? Where does it go? What will happen to the grand old party? Jacob?
Well, this is the big question. Again, it depends.
That's why I'm asking it.
I know. It depends on the election. If the Republicans retain the Senate and Trump loses, then it is merely a repudiation of Trump and Trumpism. And the Republicans will regroup and they will return to some harder core of Reaganite foreign policy, and they will emphasize fiscal responsibility, and they will embrace free trade. If the Republicans lose the Senate and the presidency, then the party's in deep trouble. And it will be riven by a fight between pro-Trump and anti-Trump factions. And Romney will lead one camp and Tom Cotton will be in the other one.
Senator Cotton, interesting. The man that managed to get the op-ed page editor of the New York Times fired for his comment. Sarah, how do you see it, the future of your party, assuming it loses on the 3rd?
It never goes back to the way it was. You can forget about Bush Republicans. And I think you can actually think about, you can say goodbye to Mitt Romney Republicans to some extent. It will take on the issue of border security more so than it did before, thanks to President Trump. It will also perhaps use tariffs and trade wars. That seems to be more widely accepted now than it ever did. But I say that the things that have been solidified in the Republican Party because of Trump that will not change are definitely tax cuts and supply side economics, as well as conservative, textualist, originalist judges. So Supreme Court judges that he's appointed, that same tradition will continue to carry through. There will also be more pro-life, more on the cultural issues, and also on the free speech issues. I see the Republican Party really embracing free speech and, conscience rights, freedom of religion. And I see Mike Pompeo as a very good bridge between the old Republican Party and the new one. He's been very good, not to steal the limelight from the president overseas, but he's also enacted his agenda very efficiently and effectively. And he's been a congressman, he's been the head of the CIA. So he has a lot of respect from his colleagues. So I see someone like a Pompeo and Nikki Haley, who served at the UN, as a possible future leader. Kristi Noem, the governor of South Dakota, who didn't lock down her state during COVID because she didn't think it was necessary. She got a ton of flack for that, and she's coming out to be a real rising star in the party. So keep your eyes on them.
Jacob, what I don't understand is where the votes come from for a future Republican Party. I mean, the current Republican Party is living off a declining base, and it depends on a differentially high turnout of that base to win elections. That's what happened in 2016. It's hoping to repeat that in 2020, though I think that's a stretch. The base has been narrowed down and down to white, blue-collar, rural, small-town workers, people who live there. The suburban base of the Republican Party used to have, seems to be going, white suburban women, the polls suggest have defected hugely. The hopes of making inroads into the black vote have barely got going. The Hispanic vote, which George Bush got a big chunk of, doesn't get now outside Florida, where you have a non-Mexican Hispanic vote there. So you get more Cubans, Venezuelans, Nicaraguans, and so on, who've lived under communism or socialism. I don't see where you cannot live forever off a white, blue-collar base. Where do you go?
They need to completely reinvent themselves. And they've been, Trump managed to give one more squeeze of the lemon in 2016. But I would wager that this time it's gone dry because, he governed as a hard right conservative. If he had been a shrewd politician, he would have tacked instantly to the middle and could have demolished the Democrats by embracing infrastructure. Instead, he handed out massive tax cuts, mainly to plutocrats. And I agree with you on his economic record, Andrew. I mean, the growth has been anemic in the United States. And that's another reason we have these high deficits. The GOP needs to become a modern political party. And right now, it's headed towards disaster.
Freddie, what's your take on the future of the GOP?
Well, I think my prediction is always more crazy, not less. I think there are elements within the Republican Party that are becoming incredibly paranoid. And, you now see quite a lot of QAnon. You hear a lot about QAnon, a sort of radical conspiracy theory that is now gripping quite large chunks of the electorate. At the same time, though, I think we have to give Trump a bit more credit, perhaps, than we have on how he has expanded the working class, the blue-collar American vote. He's made people vote and get interested in politics, get involved in the culture wars that just weren't involved before. And I think we may actually see more of these people voting in 2020 than the current polls are picking up on.
Where should the demographic base of the Republican Party aim to expand itself, Sarah, beyond the declining base that it has at the moment? I mean, even without a lot more immigration, America will become less white. It is becoming less socially conservative, particularly among young people as well. Almost everywhere you look, in every trend that's taking place, we've seen how Virginia used to be a red state, is now a blue state. Georgia is always one of these that's about to tilt because the Republicans have lost the suburbs of Atlanta. And it's increasingly dependent on the rural vote. We'll see if North Carolina tilts the same way because of that. Arizona, Maricopa County, the Republican, Goldwater, Reagan used to rock it. All of these, that was the heart of Western Republicanism. It looks like it might go for Biden in this election. It's very close. Where do you get these votes now?
Well, I actually disagree with Jacob and Freddie saying that, this and your assumption of this shrinking base and everything, because I think Donald Trump has been the disruptor the Republican Party has needed to widen the base. And I see him growth among African Americans, Hispanics, in a way that I haven't seen, well, in my lifetime with the Black vote, I'll be honest. I have never seen so many African Americans come out and support a GOP candidate before. And I'm really interested in this minority vote, this cycle, and seeing how he expands, because he is expanding his support among these demographics. And also, I think there are more working class votes that he can get and is getting. For instance, the labor votes up in, the the Democratic Party, but they're the labor unions in northern Minnesota. I mean, all the mayors of northern Minnesota who have religiously been Democratic soldiers have come out and endorsed Trump for the first time. It's because they're getting jobs back to their area. They also hate the destruction of the Black Lives Matter and the Antifa riots that happened in Minneapolis. So I actually think Trump is widening the base for the Republican Party. He's definitely changing the dynamics, because now the Republicans look to be more like the working class party, which has historically been the Democrats. And now the Democrats are embracing the metropolitan cities and suburban areas, you know, more of the country club areas. So I think it's really interesting how it's reversing, but I don't think the African Americans are going to be as loyal to Democrats going forward. And the Republicans definitely need to widen their base with his minorities and Hispanics and new citizens to America.
Freddie, do you agree with that? I mean, there are a number of black figures outside the mainstream, largely Democratic black leadership who have been vocal in favor of Trump. But all the polling I see says that he still gets less than 10% of the black vote, which is the historic position of the Republican Party to get less than that. Outside of Florida, I don't see any great move of Hispanics to the Republicans. I mean, George Bush in 2000 got 38% of the Hispanic vote. It was a peak there. I mean, Ronald Reagan once told me that that Hispanics were natural Republicans. They just didn't yet just realize it. Yeah. And that hasn't gone so well either. I can see the opportunity there to go for these votes for a mainstream Republican. I don't see Mr. Trump has done it.
I don't think he has. I think the black, I mean, we may be proved wrong on election day, but so far the black outreach doesn't seem to have helped. It has helped to some extent with white voters who worry about being racist. And if Trump is seen to be embracing black voters and encouraging black voters, it negates the idea that he's a racist. I mean, on the Hispanic vote, I think he is on course to increase it from 28% to, I think, 31, 32%, which is significant considering how big that vote is. And he's also growing among Asian Americans, which is a very fast growing demographic in America.
Yes.
But I think the big opportunity for the Republican Party will be the fact that if you once Biden is sort of taken out the way, taken out back, you are going to have a Democratic Party that becomes pretty radical, far away from what Americans and a lot of minority Americans are comfortable with. And if they move America in a direction where it'll cause a revulsion against the party, the Democratic Party, then any future Republican Party has a wide open playing field in years to come.
Sarah, did I take it that you thought Mike Pompeo could be at least a transition leader for the Republicans, that he could take the party into the 2024 election? Would that be, I'm not going to hold you to it because I know a lot can change in 4 years, but as you sit there now, was that what you were saying, that would be at the moment not a bad choice?
Yes, I think he's a strong choice for that, because he does blend both worlds, the pre-Trump era and the Trump era. I also think Nikki Haley is also someone who also blends that well. She had been governor of South Carolina, you know, a big primary state.
She's quite a mainstream Republican though, isn't she?
Yeah, yeah. But she served very well as UN ambassador, US ambassador to the UN. And so she left on her own terms in a Trump administration. So she left on a good high note. So I think those are two ones to watch, which is really interesting because they're foreign policy focused candidates, not so much domestic. Yes. But I think Trump has been most successful, or very successful on the international stage as well. So,
well, some of the things he's done there haven't really been issues in this election. His China policy, it seems to me, is the new normal now in Washington. That's the consensus. Perhaps not with Mr. Biden, but certainly with a lot of Democrats on the Hill. It's been interesting that the media hasn't really given him the credit he should get for what's happened in the Middle East, with Israel being recognized by the UAE and Bahrain, and I think very soon Saudi Arabia and Oman as well. But Jake, I'm going to come to you for the final thing on the Republican Party, and it's this. In 1997, the British Conservative Party was pretty much destroyed by Tony Blair. He won the biggest majority ever. And it took to the year 2010, it took 13 years for the Tories to get themselves back to power, but they did it. And they've been in power for the past 10 years. So it took a while, but they resurged. Mr. Macron in the 2017 French election destroyed the Gaullists. He destroyed the Socialist Party too, but he destroyed the Gaullist party, the centre-right party of France. Centre-right party of France is still nowhere. Is down to about 9–10% in the polls. The National Front, the sort of hard-line nativist party, is the biggest right-wing party in France now. So where are the Republicans going to be? Are they going to learn from the British Conservatives, or are they going to end up in irrelevance like the French Gaullists?
Initially, they'll follow the Gaullist path. My own prediction is it'll take 12 years. You'll have 2 terms of Biden, contrary to what everyone thinks.
Really? He'll run again?
Yes.
Wow.
If he's
That's
a smashing
bold.
success, there's no way that he won't run again.
Wow.
It's all lined up for him. He's got 4 years to turn
there are
around
going to be
the
some
economy.
amazing advances in medicine in the next 4 years.
Conrad
Anyway,
Adenauer.
you're saying the 2020s are a democratic decade. That's what you're telling us.
That's my guess. But you know, it'll be. This happened to the Democrats too. I mean, it took them several elections to regroup after Jimmy Carter lost. It takes parties a long time.
It did indeed. It took 2 terms of Reagan and the term of Bush Sr. Indeed. Listen, we're going to leave it there. I thank you all for joining. It's been a great discussion, and a discussion rather than an ideological shouting match, which is what I see on so much American television these days. I hope you'll all come back and join us again as we build this little Spectator TV franchise. Just a reminder, if you want to hear more from Spectator journalists, the kind we've had in the program, subscribe to the Spectator's monthly print edition of the US, and also at spectator.us/subscribe. You get a discount if you enter TV code, and also you get all of our online access, which is constantly updated because Freddie never sleeps. He just keeps on posting and posting and posting. Sarah, Jacob,
I'm
a
on the same
pleasure.
drugs as Trump.
Exactly. A pleasure for you to join us. Thanks to our friend from the New York Post. Thanks for you for watching. But we'll see you all next week. Bye-bye.